Welcome to SpringLaw's Spring Forward Legal Updates webinar series. This series is designed to provide a comprehensive legal overview of key issues related to employment law and human rights in Ontario. SpringLaw is a virtual employment law firm advising on workplace legal issues for employers, employees, freelancers, and executives from a wide range of industries. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar and find it useful and informative. To reach our team, please visit us at springlaw.ca. And now to our presenters.
Good morning and welcome to our Spring Forward Legal Updates monthly webinar series. Today is our ninth out of our 2021 monthly webinars, and we are discussing trauma-informed investigations. So my name is Emily Sue. I'm one of the lawyers at SpringLaw, and joining me today is Flo Vineberg. We are employment, workplace investigation, and human rights lawyers at a virtual law firm based out of Ontario. Feel free to ask questions using the chat function. We would like to get through everything and have quite a bit of content. So if we're unable to get to your question, feel free to email us following the presentation. And you can also download some of our slides under the Handouts tab. And finally, for more information about our law firm, please visit our website at springlaw.ca, where we have blog posts, COVID-19 information for employers, a link to subscribe to our monthly newsletter, subscription program for employers, and an ebook for employees who have recently been fired.
And just to add, as we're going to introduce the subject, this is a follow-up to part one of our webinar series, and there's going to be discussion about gender-based violence. And so before we get into any details, we just wanted to offer a trigger warning to registrants in case there's some uncomfortable content that you might want to be aware of.
We are lawyers and know that legal disclaimers are never fun to read, but sometimes they're necessary to have. So we've included a slide with our legal disclaimers, which you can feel free to go through at your leisure.
So just to recap, this was a follow-up from part one where we discussed a spate of sexual assaults on campus during orientation week at Western University. We discussed amending regulations that were filed by the government to the Sexual Violence at Colleges and Universities Act, and how the university itself conducted and has been conducting its investigations alongside the police. So that was the backdrop to part one. And so to continue on with that for part two, we decided to have this webinar on trauma-informed investigations to continue with the sexual and gender-based violence focus. In part just because it's a continuation from part one, but also because it's topical with the Me Too movement. It's become increasingly complex for workplace investigators given the prevalence of social media and social consciousness around gender-based violence. There are additional conversations around intersectionality and how the different forms of people's identities might impact the experience of trauma and how that might come to bear on a workplace investigation. Issues around legislative compliance, so we'll discuss Bill 132 and the Occupational Health and Safety Act provisions around the duty to investigate and to not condone certain discriminatory behavior, and also just the notion that trauma-informed investigations now are sound and efficacious business practices for a variety of reasons we're going to discuss.
So we're going to start off with a brief description into the neurobiology of trauma response to traumatic stimuli, go into memory and manifestations of trauma, and then discuss what sexual assault is and sexual harassment is, and the methodology around sexual assault and harassment. And then we'll delve into the purpose of trauma-informed investigations, or TIIs, as well as best practices. And then finally talk about the role of trauma-informed workplace investigators, and hopefully have some time for some questions and answers, as well as some of our takeaways.
So as you can see, we have quite a full schedule. So this we could do 100 webinars on the neuroscience behind trauma, but we wanted to include this less than 5-minute take on it to just say that people's brains are actually physiologically, neurologically impacted when they experience trauma. So this is a slide to demonstrate that when someone experiences a traumatic event, there is a release of chemicals, and I've given you a list of some of those there, that essentially interfere with brain functioning. And the two main regions of the brain that are impacted by this are the hippocampus and the amygdala. They do different things. The hippocampus plays a significant role in the formation of what we call explicit or cognitive memories. Those are memories that we can actually recall and narrate later on, but they are conscious. And the amygdala, which is more prominent in terms of sensory or behavioral or emotional responses that we often link with survival instincts. So the release of these chemicals interferes with brain functioning in those two regions especially. The amygdala is part of the limbic system, which also is about our behavioral and emotional responses. And all of those functions are involved with what we know as the encoding of memory. And in the next slide, we'll just briefly explain how encoding is one part of the memory creation process. And these can often lead to, as you can see on this slide, certain manifestations of trauma, both in the moment and after, at the point of re-triggering. That might include fight, flight, or freeze. And sometimes the freeze response is called tonic immobility, which is caused by an influx of hormones when someone has experienced trauma that actually can lead to complete muscle paralysis. And it's actually estimated by some studies that between 12 and 50% of sexual assault survivors do report this during their assaults. So all of this to say, conducting a trauma-informed workplace investigation does involve some knowledge of the fact that trauma will impact the way memories are encoded and a witness's ability to recall events that will often be fragmented and not necessarily in a chronology, but actually more sensory. So this is a very brief slide. I'm not going to get into it in detail, but please feel free to email us at SpringLaw afterwards if you have questions about the formation of memory, which is a dynamic process. As you can see on the slide, there are three types of memory: sensory, short-term, and long-term. Our brains possess two types of long-term memories: explicit, which are our cognitive memories, and implicit, which are our sensory or emotional ones. And it is often these sensory or emotional memories that become fragmented, and recall becomes incredibly difficult for people who have experienced trauma. So I explained that there were three processes involved in the formation of memory: encoding, storage, and retrieval. And the retrieval is essentially the part that trauma survivors have difficulty with. These memories are often difficult to verbalize. As I mentioned, they become fragmented, especially in time. And they mostly consist of primarily sensory information. So part of the trauma-informed approach might involve asking questions to elicit details around sensory things like smell or sound, as opposed to a straight chronology. So we'll get into this in more detail, but suffice to say, the brain is actually impacted by experiences of trauma, and we don't encode these types of memories the same as we might do regular everyday life experiences.
So what are some implications for memory consolidation for trauma-informed investigations? Well, you can look at the timing of interviews. That's a big consideration. Scientific research on memory stabilization, which is the process of a newly formed long-term memory through consolidation, significantly impacts the timing of interviews with trauma survivors, especially sexual and gender-based violence. So a person who's interviewed shortly after a traumatic event occurs, when they're still stressed or traumatized, will not be able to retrieve anything encoded to their brain. Initially, the unconsolidated memory is in a fragile state. But over time, the memory becomes resilient to interference, and this process is known as consolidation. And full sleep cycles have been suggested for the episodic memory circuitry to consolidate information that was encoded at the time of the traumatic incident. And during memory consolidation, the brain will reorganize and integrate memory traces that were initially fragile into the long-term storage. Okay, and trauma can impact recall. So sensory recall, not necessarily chronological. Recall can improve over time, or it may not improve at all. So enhanced memory coexists with incomplete memory in some situations. And the affect that someone who has undergone trauma may display when they're describing or attempting to recall traumatic events may seem counterintuitive or even evasive. So they may display, they may be smiling or laughing or seemingly numb or detached. There are a whole variety of different affects that could be displayed, and that has to be considered. When it comes to the timing of interviews, you have to contemplate as an investigator the memory consolidation and the potential for re-traumatizing. And it's important to have enhanced neutrality and non-judgment when conducting trauma-informed investigations in order to come out with the best outcomes. And when it comes to the ways in which trauma is manifested, we understand that trauma is manifested in one of three ways, which I'm sure you've heard about before: the flight or fight response, as well as the freeze response. One example of the freeze response is tonic immobility, which Flo touched on briefly earlier.
So Emily just talked about some of the in-the-moment manifestations of trauma. This long, non-exhaustive list of all the other possible manifestations of trauma, including someone being angry or withdrawn, smiling, dissociative, etc. We mention these for a few reasons. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but just to say all of these things might be something that someone who has experienced trauma brings to an interview. And they might have some bearing on either the investigation itself, but also the investigative process. And so as a trauma-informed workplace investigator, it's important to have an understanding about what some of these cues might be, and to have what we might call an exit plan, which is to say, if you have a sense that someone is perhaps being re-triggered, either you are able to shift your line of questioning to a similar or adjacent topic in the meantime, or to allow that witness to have a support person, or to even call off the interview in its entirety, because the do no harm approach has to be the foundation for a trauma-informed investigation. And so this list is just to say, you know, anything that is based on the perception of a witness's credibility after they've experienced trauma, there needs to be some contemplation of any or all of these things and other manifestations that you might come across. Our one caveat would also just be that as trauma-informed workplace investigators, you're not expected to be a therapist or a clinician, but just to be mindful of some of the possibilities of these things surfacing and being prepared so that you know how to respond.
When it comes to triggers, you might have someone enter a room, for instance, that reminds the individual of trauma, and there are multiple ways in which trauma can be triggered, and you can't account for all of the environmental stimuli as an investigator that could trigger flashbacks and so on. But it is good to have some awareness of the ways that it may manifest, just as a best practice for an investigator and also for the employer. So it's good to keep in mind that there could be sensory or memory-related triggers.
So we talk about this in terms of the balance. So what Emily was mentioning in the slide before is the idea of triggers. And this is to say that the balance of incorporating a trauma-informed approach is not that it should cause prejudice to the respondent, or that, you know, someone who alleges a sexual assault or sexual harassment is automatically believed, or that everyone who experiences those things undergoes trauma. That there is a balance to be struck. So as a trauma-informed workplace investigator, you still have a job to do, which is to gauge witnesses' credibility, and not all inconsistencies or counterintuitive behaviors like laughing or smiling are necessarily driven by trauma-related hormones or impacted memory. So, you know, there is a significant amount of skill in incorporating this approach. That can be honed through practice and through training and through understanding the limitations of a trauma-informed approach, and awareness. So we say emotional literacy here about reading some of the cues of trauma, but also knowing that there are limitations to that sometimes, and you still have a fact-finding role to play. And then the implementation of the trauma-informed approach with professionalism and getting getting parties buy-in. And we are going to talk about that a bit more, but there is a balance to be struck. There's a great quote by Jim Hopper, who is a psychologist, and he says, "Gaps and inconsistencies in memory are never on their own proof of anyone's credibility, innocence, or guilt." And I think that that's just a good thing to keep in mind, because procedural fairness safeguards will help to counter the perception that a trauma-informed approach is a free pass for complainants.
So we're going to talk about some definitions of sexual assault and sexual harassment. The sexual assault is an offense under the Criminal Code, specifically Section 271. Under the Ontario Human Rights Code, sexual harassment is defined as, quote, engaging in a course of vexatious comment or conduct that is known or ought to be known to be unwelcome, end quote. And that includes a whole variety of different behaviors, ranging from unwelcome sexual flirtation, propositions or gestures, to verbal harassment like jokes or innuendos, graphic verbal comments about one's physical characteristics, clothing or appearance, unintentional, unwanted physical contact, of course, but also some situations in which actions are not directed toward a specific person. So for instance, just inappropriate displays of sexual pictures or materials or videos can also be considered as a harassment. Sexual solicitation is another example. And importantly, reprisal or the threat of reprisal for rejection of sexual solicitation or advances. That's also considered to be a sexual harassment. We note that the Occupational Health and Safety Act defines workplace violence in particular as the, quote, exercise of physical force by a person against a worker in a workplace that causes or could cause physical injury to the worker, and also includes sexual violence.
So it's, we need to talk about the mythology around sexual assault and sexual harassment in order to effectively have a trauma-informed approach. Just very quickly, some of the general myths that a workplace investigator might come across, in someone's narrative or the evidence that they give. Well, she or he didn't cry or scream, or why didn't they fight or resist? Issues around consent, and that if someone was silent or passive, perhaps they consented to the behavior. The role of prior conduct, perhaps if it were more serious, that person would have said something or would have said something sooner. These are all general myths around gender-based violence that courts now are working hard to dispel. And it's good to be aware of them, because if you hear some of this stuff as a trauma-informed workplace investigator, it's good to be able to put it into context, because certainly there is no right or wrong way to respond to trauma. And part of incorporating this approach is understanding that. Especially the workplace dynamics are important. So, you are trying to, you're trying to base your credibility assessments on the evidence that you're given, but certainly questions around, was there a power imbalance, age differentials, a hierarchy? Was there a workplace culture around gossip or rumors or some sort of social positioning that would prevent someone from feeling comfortable to report a sexual assault or harassment allegation? Does the organization or the company value things like employee safety and well-being, and are there well-known channels for complaints of this nature? The incapacity, so if it's a work-related event and there is substance abuse or intoxication at play, how is the organization going to address that? And as a workplace investigator, where do you put that in terms of gathering your evidence? So these are just some of the mythologies that are important to be aware of and to work through within your limited means or role as an investigator. And the Canadian consent law, supposed to be primer, apologies for that. The criminal code outlines our understanding of consent, and the important thing to highlight is that consent has to be voluntary and ongoing. The person has to be capable of consenting and to provide informed consent. So the purpose then, just to sort of sum up as we go along, the purpose of the trauma-informed investigation is really to gather a more robust evidentiary portrayal of a traumatic event while avoiding frustration and withdrawal from the process. So if there is the perception that a workplace investigator is committed to implementing that approach and to understanding that the nature of their questioning might be adjusted to better accommodate for or account for trauma. So for example, asking more sensory questions as opposed to a narrative or a chronology, you might actually get a fuller portrayal of what happened, which of course will lead to a better, more efficacious outcome by providing a fuller report. It encourages witnesses to share what they are able to recall about their experience within the context of non-judgment, non-victim blaming, professionalism, and certainly procedural fairness and an understanding of the process. And dispelling the myth that being informed about trauma and taking that into account does not equate with prejudice to the respondent. All parties benefit when this approach is used in certain circumstances.
So what does a trauma-informed investigation really mean? We have a great quote which summarizes a lot of what these investigations encompass. The quote is, "Investigators need to understand the potential effects of trauma so that they can check their personal biases and avoid the uncritical assumption that individuals who report sexual assault are necessarily lying if they can't remember every detail of the incident in a chronological manner. If investigators understand that nonlinear or partial recall may be related to potential trauma, then they can avoid biased snap judgments, move forward objectively, and gather information about what the reporting party is able to recall." And just some best practices going forward as an investigator. Obviously the first step is to investigate. So there isn't a definition in the Ministry of Labor Code of Practice for the term incident. But when in doubt, it's always best to err on the side of vigilance and action and investigate. And when you as an employer become aware of an occurrence of harassment or violence or assault, or even potential harassment, it is a good practice to conduct an investigation. And the jurisprudence suggests that the employer has the duty to investigate, but also not to perpetuate the existing harassment or violence or assault, and not condone or worsen the situation.
So step 2 then of the best practices would be the actual implementation. And this is where the idea of procedural fairness safeguards bumps up against with the free pass myth. And this is just to say that procedural fairness safeguards, again, benefit everyone. So outlining the process to all the parties, managing expectations about what is involved, clarifying your mandate as the investigator if necessary, timelines, the scope or the possibility of confidentiality, the resolution process, and again, your role as the investigator. Clarifying these things up front, I think, assists with buy-in and actually helps to build trust and rapport with witnesses who have experienced trauma, but also for respondents who maybe are part of this process and are going through their own experience being named as a respondent in a workplace investigation. So, it's good to dispel this idea that procedural fairness cannot be incorporated or implemented in a fair way. And, as it says at the bottom of the slide, the trauma-informed approach does not mean substituting trauma theory for evidence or abdicating a fulsome fact-finding role. Both of those things can coexist in a professional and respectful way, and both add integrity to the process.
So some questions you can ask as a trauma-informed investigator are those that are non-presumptive, which is more of a neutral question. You can ask open-ended questions. Be careful not to cross-examine the individual. So you can ask the individual to elaborate without pressing, saying things like, "Please tell me more about that." You allow them to take their time. So you can ask, "Can you describe what else you remember about that day? Have I missed anything that you would like to add?" And these questions really assist with many situations and allow for you to get a more fulsome picture that's unbiased and non-judgmental.
So some things to avoid or adjust when you're implementing a trauma-informed approach. Again, you approach the witnesses without judgment and without victim blaming. That also is predicated on being aware of some of the myths that we discussed earlier around sexual assault and sexual harassment survivors. Refraining from asking closed-ended questions or anything that might reinforce those myths, but also being aware of your own prejudices, your own biases. You're not expected to be perfect. Everybody is informed by their experiences, but part of being able to implement the trauma-informed approach is being aware of what you might be bringing in as a workplace investigator and understanding the ways that trauma might manifest in the people you're speaking with and interviewing, so that you can keep things in context and it can help you elicit the most information possible in the most respectful way. The one thing that I just wanted to highlight on this slide is the ability to reframe. So trauma-informed workplace investigators have a big role to play, and being able to abandon your chronology of questions or the formatting of your questions and how you planned to conduct your interviews by adjusting your line of questions according to witness recall and capacity might be helpful for eliciting more information. So if it seems that someone is answering more about some of the sensory cues they experienced, you might find yourself going off on a different trajectory, but ultimately you might be able to get that more robust evidentiary portrayal of the events that happened. So the process needs to be a bit more dynamic, and there needs to be substantial cue reading based on the witnesses you're speaking to incorporate that idea of trauma, and here are some things to avoid. So to bring it all together, the role of the trauma-informed workplace investigators, then we call this the principled approach, and we've discussed a number of these things, and we would like to leave some time for questions, but just important to highlight that terminology is so important. So using impartial or gender neutral language and being thorough can help preserve the integrity of the investigative process. You can be empathetic to someone who has experienced trauma without extending sympathy, because of course you need to maintain your neutrality. The protocols around procedural fairness have been designed hopefully to minimize harm and to prioritize witness safety and well-being, and that should be the foundation of any trauma-informed investigation. And finally, I would say that if you understand how trauma might manifest based on some of the things we discussed earlier, you may be able to anticipate some distress or pay attention to those cues more effectively next time. So the presence of a support person might be something that you recommend, and also the efforts that you make to really build trust and rapport while remaining neutral will probably go a long way in your investigation.
Okay, so last but not least, we have a few takeaways. Just like to discuss briefly the purpose of trauma-informed investigations. One of which is that you are able to, with these sorts of investigations, facilitate information gathered in a balanced manner for all individuals and all parties. You can get a more fulsome narrative with better outcomes, and also bolstered perception of not only the investigator, but also the employer. And these sorts of investigations help to deconstruct prejudice and isms, and allow for enhanced cultural competence and a critical lens through which the business can view their workplaces. So that concludes today's Spring Forward Legal Update. I see there aren't any questions so far. So if there aren't any other questions, we hope that you'll join us on our next webinar on December 15th. Details and a registration link are posted on our website, or will be, and feel free to follow up with any of our lawyers. If you have any questions about the presentation or otherwise, you can also visit our website and follow us on social media. And you can also sign up for a monthly newsletter to stay up to date. We do have one question, it looks like.
I think it's a comment, actually. A comment just about how trauma can lead to substance abuse and addiction. And that is absolutely one of the manifestations of trauma that people might experience. It's quite common. And if someone is willing to share this with you as a workplace investigator, you should be prepared to hear and handle that information to ensure that people feel dignified and that trust is built, because those are often vulnerable things to share. And substance abuse and addiction might also impact memory recall. So just another manifestation of trauma that workplace investigators can not expect, but can try to prepare for just in case.
Okay. We have one other question, it looks like. If they don't ask for a support person, should you offer it anyways as the investigator?
I have a thought.
Sorry?
So if they don't ask for a support person, I would always offer. Some people will accept that. Other people are not interested in having other people be present because it's shameful. I would always offer, and I would also just make sure as part of procedural fairness to remind people that they can take breaks at any time if they need water, if they need to get food, if they need a cigarette break. You might have to reschedule part of the interview that you're not able to finish for another date because it's just too much for them to process or recall in one sitting. So it does require a bit of a dynamic approach, but certainly I would always offer a support person and clarify that person's role, that they are there in a support capacity only and not to be participating in the interview itself.
Okay, and that seems like all the questions we have for today. Thank you for joining us, and hopefully we can see you at our next webinar. Have a good day.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.